welcome to Nothing Is Real, a podcast about the Beatles. My name is Jason Carty.
My name's Stephen Cockcroft.
And we're live on tape from Dublin and Belfast. Today we are going to look at just one song, the 1968 song Revolution, which is a track that spins off in a couple of different directions as it takes shape throughout the summer of 1968. And it's an interesting one, isn't it, Stephen? It kind of comes at a busy time professionally for them.
It is. They've come back from their trip to India. They're launching Apple. Paul and John have had their May press conference in America announcing that. I think the public are interested to see what's happening. This form of Western communism that they're touting. They're starting to solicit contributions and tapes and scripts and from various people, and plus they have to get round to the business of recording the new album.
Yeah, they've had a number one while they've been in India with Lady Madonna, and people are still wanting them to get back into the studio. And so there's a couple of things we need to think about when we think about the song Revolution. And probably the first thing to look at, and we should state for the record, we are not historians in the broadest sense, but there is a context of activity in 1968. There's an environment that this song is being written in and that it comes out to that is, I suppose, not unlike some of the chaotic times that we're seeing in 2020, but people are waiting for a statement. And so there's a lot in 68 that people need to keep in the back of their mind, isn't there?
There is. And I mean, it's perhaps difficult at this remove from 1968 to appreciate just how seriously the sort of fear was of insurrection, rebellion, revolution, that there was a sense of that the existing order was under threat. And you have America embroiled in the war in Vietnam. In January, the Viet Cong had launched the Tet Offensive, which was a sort of push back against American forces. And I think this is the point at which certainly the American government and the American people start to think we are not going to win this war. This war is not capable of being won. In February 68, the government in the States announced 543 US soldiers had been killed in a single week, which was the highest death toll. The war, it's an election year, and the war is the big issue.
Yeah, and the American election. I mean, the song Revolution, gets put down in May and June, but 1968 as a whole, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening on the far side of that as well. There's political assassinations. There's the withdrawal of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who doesn't seek re-election in the American presidential race. There's a chaotic Democratic National Convention that year. There's the Prague Spring out in Eastern Europe. It's a very volatile time.
It is. It's a very tumultuous time, and you've got to remember that this song was written in India. It's recorded in May, June, so you're coming right in the middle of. In April, Martin Luther King has been assassinated. In May, I suppose the big event right across May is the student risings in Paris. It's maybe incorrect to say it's a student rising. I mean, it's social upheaval. Yeah. In France. I mean, at one point, the government, de Gaulle has fled at one point to Germany briefly. The government is about to fall. So all of this is going on around the time is that the song is being recorded. And then, as you say, in the back end of the year, when this song comes out as a B-side of Hey Jude and on the album, those events are still continuing. As you say, in August, the Chicago Democratic Convention, I suppose all of that leads up to Nixon winning the election at the beginning of November.
Yeah.
So it plays out the sort of the composition, the recording, the release, and the public reception is playing out against this this background across the whole year. And as you say, everything the Beatles did at that point is being paid attention, and it's are they going to comment? What people are waiting, as you say, they're waiting for a statement.
Yeah, and certainly there's a bit of we are post 60s people, really. So we've always looked at the 60s through a rear view mirror, and it
Mm.
kind of gets posted as this sort of, oh, there's a man looking at a military jacket in Carnaby Street type thing,
Yes, yes.
and it was swinging and it was fantastic. But I think, the 60s in the United States meant something very different to the 60s in London, and London meant something very different to the rest of the UK. But it's interesting how globally there's a lot of unrest in 68, that it all kind of tips over, and it's something that isn't as well known as the kind of the jolly swinging part of the 60s, you could say sometimes.
No, I think that's right, and I think we touched on this on an episode last season, which is this shift from swinging London
Yeah.
to America, and particularly the West Coast, and that's a much more it's much more aggressive music. It's the music of protest. It's hard rock. And yes, I think London, we're not, the UK is not directly involved in the war in Vietnam. I suppose the big event in 68 in London is the 100,000 people marching on the American embassy, Grosvenor Square, in March.
Yeah.
But that is a sort of statement of solidarity with protests in America. But then everyone the next day can get up and go about their business and go back to college and
Yeah.
go back to their job. And so America is really the center of that protest movement. And in Europe, it's really France is the protest. But these protests are breaking out all across the Western world.
And what's different then to now is, at that point, the pop culture, there was this notion of, oh, actually, there's this voice of a generation thing that certain people have, and people are looking to see, well, what will Dylan say, what will the Beatles say, what will X, Y, and Z say. And you talk about the March 1968 protest at the American embassy in London, which had
Mm.
100,000 protesters. But that maybe should let us segue into somebody else who was a voice of the generation at the time and who was involved or who was at those protests, which was Mick Jagger. And we
Yes,
might talk a little
yes.
bit about the Stones and Street Fighting Man, because Jagger was there in March 68, and that kind of influenced him, didn't it?
Yes, I'm always quite skeptical about Jagger. He's a bit of a chameleon, and he sort of skirts around, plays with fire. The sort of the danger of student demonstration. There's the politics. He still does this today. He sort of dips in and out of political statements with lyrics that he writes, but certainly the descriptions of him there are, that he was linking arms with the students, and then suddenly he is recognized and he becomes the focus, and the press are trying to get an interview with him. He's on camera, and he sort of realizes that his fame isn't, it's not going to allow him to be a leader in this circumstances. His fame is a distraction,
Mm.
but nevertheless, this is something that whether he feels genuinely moved by the cause, or whether he thinks this is a good vehicle for a song. This is a good subject matter for a song. But he repurposes an existing track lyrically, and comes up with Street Fighting Man. And this is sort of in parallel with what Lennon is doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say I know 5% as much about the Stones as I do about the Beatles, and I can blow a bit hot and cold on them. But Street Fighting Man would be one of my favorite
Mm.
Stones tracks. And as you say, it's interesting. It begins life as this song called "Did Everyone Pay Their Dues," which is a very dull, prosaic type title,
Yeah.
And that line is the line, "What can a poor boy do?" That was originally "Did everyone pay their dues," which is
Yes.
is kind of not very rock and roll in a way.
It's not saying much. It's not. No. It's not saying much.
And that's available on YouTube.
Yes, what I like about about Street Fighting Man is it's sort of the template for what carries the Stones through the next three or four albums. That sort of scrubbed acoustic guitars
Yes.
with layering on top of it of electric guitars, and that's the kind of, and with piano as well, and it's that Beggar's Banquet sound that kind of carries them through, and I love that
Yeah,
sound.
they really flipped a switch in 68, because you think of
Mm.
67, you have Sergeant Pepper, and then 6 months later, Satanic Majesties. You know, there's this kind of
Yeah,
carbon copy, Stones in the Shadow type thing that John and Paul would bitch about at the time and later, that
constantly.
yeah,
Yeah,
that the Stones were kind of copying them. And in '68, Jimmy Miller starts producing them, and they do Honky Tonk Women and they do Street Fighting Man, and they kind of pull away into the Stones we kind of know today. And
yeah,
whether Street Fighting Man is cynical or not, it certainly has a great sound. And you could argue that the Stones, they're not necessarily setting the template for writing a song about revolution, but they are ahead of the curve a little bit in terms of fashioning this song, because they write it in March, they record it in April, May. It doesn't really come out till later in the summer, so we don't really know whether it was in the Beatles eye line at all.
yeah.
But they are certainly getting better at defining themselves and sticking their
I,
finger up to the wind and seeing which way it's going.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. The Stones have that harder edge sound, and that's what '68 is all about. You've got Hendrix, you've got Cream, you've got those West Coast bands. There's a shift in the sound of what popular music is, what popular music should be doing, and I suppose, and we maybe come on to this when we look at the sort of critical reaction and response, the way that Revolution is received. There's a slight notion at this stage. The Beatles are identified with Sergeant Pepper, 1967, The Summer of Love, All You Need Is Love. It's all sort of peace and flowers and looking for jackets in Carnaby Street. But 1968 is not about that. It's
Yeah.
completely different. There's been a complete sea change in sort of youth culture, if that term existed at the time. The generation gap has suddenly just completely widened. The Beatles, I think, again, this is one of my pet theories, is that the Beatles were responsible in a way for keeping that gap closed,
Yeah.
because everybody could like the Beatles. The kids and the grannies and the mums and the dads and the politicians, and could see the benefit. But 1968, all that is cast aside, and perhaps that Summer of Love is just a memory by the time you get to Summer of '68.
Yeah. And so they come back from India with a bunch of songs, our Beatle friends. And
Yeah,
Revolution is one of these songs fashioned up in the hills of India. And it's not really, for a song about revolution, India's a pretty peaceful place.
yeah. Lennon made a comment about this in his Jan Wenner interview in 1970, and he said, I'd been thinking about this up in the hills in India. I still had this "God will save us all" feeling. Everything's going to be all right. I wanted to talk. I wanted to say my piece about the revolution, but everything's going to be okay. So he's writing it from that. That standpoint, that at the end, he knows times are hard. There is a revolution coming, but it's going to be all right, and it's essentially a positive message.
Yeah. And so we get to this question, or this point in time, where it's like, well, we need a new Beatle record. We need to get
Yeah,
recording. And the 30th of May is when Revolution becomes the first song recorded for what eventually becomes the White Album. But we need to rewind
yeah,
a little bit, because there's a little bit of work before that. And May, as we have said, is busy. And what's interesting is they had block booked Abbey Road from the 20th of May onwards, but they don't
yeah.
use that first week at all. And they're due to
No.
be in there every day too till midnight. And it gets booked from the end of May to the end of July. But famously, we know what happens first is the Esher demos happen.
Yes. You wonder why, if they had Abbey Road booked, they didn't do the rehearsals and the demos,
Yeah, they had it booked that time. It's very strange.
in the studio, but instead, they head out to George's house, and this is really the first time, I think, that they've done this sort of pre-production work. Sometimes they'll go into the studio and they'll sketch something out, and they'll do rehearsal, and they'll wipe those tapes, and then they'll go for a take. But here, they're actually sitting around playing these numbers as a block of songs.
But really, if you think about it, they had worked so much on the hoof for the previous
Mm,
5.5 years, and it's worth reminding ourselves it's 5.5 years since Love Me Do,
yeah,
that they never really probably had more than two or three songs ready to go at any point
ready
in
to
time.
go
They
at any one
certainly never would
time.
have
Yeah,
had whatever it was, how many ended up on the Esher demos tape, 30 odd songs.
Yeah.
They just didn't have them before, so it did make sense to just write down these very brief sketches. And I suppose we don't really know the recording order of the Esher demos. Sure, we don't.
No, no. I mean, I've always just perhaps naively assumed it's as they come as you hear them on the tape, but
We're not sure.
we're not sure. But they're clearly sketching out the arrangements, and it's clear here that John has a very fixed idea of what this song is going to be like, and it's pretty much all there except for the final, that Chairman Mao
Yeah.
verse.
And the Esher demos are now part of the expanded 2018 White album, so it's on the three
Yeah,
CD and the full box set version. And the demo is it's infectious. It's great.
it is. I mean, you can see you can see the merit in the song straight away. I mean, this is not something that you think he's going to have to take in, which is very often the case with John songs, that he takes something in and then Paul sprinkles his fairy dust on it and it becomes kind of sweeter, or this is all there and it's immediately infectious. It's a pretty simple sort of shuffle arrangement.
Yeah.
Um,
And something I'll probably touch on again, because it kind of feels like the first solo Lennon song. You listen to that demo and it's infectious. It sounds like a different thing. He's not
mm,
necessarily doing a Bob Dylan kind of vibe. He's not necessarily doing a Mr. Kite, fun Beatles kind of vibe.
yeah,
It's certainly not a love song. It really is him trying to speak as him to get something across, but yet
I,
still you can still dance to it.
yes. I mean, I think this is what he was sort of saying. He wanted to speak about the war. He was fed up with the Beatles being constrained. Epstein's no longer around, so there is that sense of freedom. And yes, this is maybe at that point the most personal song that he's committed, at least the most openly personal. We've had songs where he's writing about his own experiences before, but they've been sort of hidden or under arrangements, or they've been, help has been speeded up to make it
Mm.
a catchy mop top single. But here is, this is maybe the template for what comes later around 1970, Plastic Ono Band, that sort of feeling.
And so the demo has John on acoustic guitar and he's singing. The others are clapping and occasionally joining in. And John double tracks some of his guitar and vocals on the demo as well. And so, is there something in that in the official Esher demo CD? Have they tinkered with the Revolution demo?
They they have what they've done is they've fixed the timing. Lennon sort of famously was sort of wayward in his sense of time and timekeeping, and he would put in extra bars and extra beats and things like that. But the timing sort of is off. If you hear the original tape, and what they've done is they've fixed it through sort of digital trickery so
Yeah.
that it is all in the same tempo. Um, I'm not sure. I was going to say I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I know exactly how I feel about that. I don't like it. I think, well, if
But you'll
I'm
have to go
listening,
along with it, Stephen. Do
I
you know?
have to. I don't like it, but I have to go along with it. It's why do you need to fix this? They were sitting, yeah, round a tape recorder in George's living room, presumably, and why not just let us hear? No one's expecting this to be studio perfect.
Well,
Um,
I mean, you told me this, and I didn't notice, and I went back and I listened to the official release again, and I still don't really notice. So, why are they doing it? I don't. I totally understand why you don't like it, and I can understand why it would be something that would not be liked. However,
because I'm a cantankerous old man.
that's not what I'm saying. That's what I'm implying. But at the same time, I like this notion of what are these boxes trying to do? And this is not Bob Dylan Bootleg Volume 12. This is the
Yeah.
Beatles still trying to entertain Mac Shaw a little bit, put out something that everyone's going to like, including the musos and the casual buyers who might only buy one box set a year. I think.
So you're saying that this is all Paul's doing?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And so therefore it's
Um,
a good idea.
I suppose it's that tension between um, presenting an historical artifact
Yes.
or a piece of entertainment. And my view is, well, we've got the piece of entertainment in the sort of
The
polished
album
up
itself. Yeah.
album itself.
Yeah.
So give us the unadulterated original. But I'm joking about saying this is Paul, but Paul is notorious for doing this in his own box sets.
Mm.
So he will take a song that was recorded in 1972, and before he puts it in the box set, he'll just add a little kind of bass riff, or he'll polish it up, or he'll get it remixed. And I think that's not one thing and it's not another.
Yeah.
It's a kind of Frankenstein.
But it's like the Stones did it on Sticky Fingers. There's new Lennon vocals on, or new Jagger vocals on the Sticky
Yeah,
Fingers box
yeah.
set from a few years back, isn't it? Which is
I,
all a
I
bit
don't I
strange.
don't. Although those are very good, I have to say. But anyway,
That's for the whatever the
that's
Rolling
for our
Stones podcast
Parallels
is
Stones
called.
podcast. Yeah, coming
um,
soon.
so we're going to get to the big day itself, which is May the 30th, which is the first recording studio day for the White Album, and the song that they're going for is John's Revolution, and
Yeah.
John obviously thinks highly of the song. The band think highly of the song. There's this question of it might be a single.
Yeah, might be the new single.
Uh,
Certainly, John after the event would have said that.
yeah, and I like this notion of that. The first song of the album is a John song, that it sets the template, and it follows a pattern that the first song they recorded for Revolver was Tomorrow Never Knows. The first song they recorded for Sergeant Pepper was Strawberry Fields, and John comes in and he sort of sets is it a roadmap or a template or a vibe? He sort of lays down the card or the
Yeah.
gauntlet for what's about to happen.
And do you think you think he's insisting on that, or do you think the others are just sort of saying, well, we've got to indulge? There is form where you sort of indulge John and let him do his thing.
I don't think it's
to keep him
indulging.
happy.
I think, in deference to Paul, Paul recognized, John's greatness and loved, and I don't think anything made Paul happier. I can't think of any instance where Paul undermined a John song, really. And I think he would have been
No.
more than happy to, and what we'll see is actually it takes a while for Paul to get his feet under the desk of making the White Album. But
Yeah.
I don't think Paul would have done that with any kind of, biting his lip or anything. I certainly think, though, that there's stuff happening on that day that is different for all of them, because maybe we should talk about the Yoko in the room.
Yes, well, they're all there. All the key members of the Beatles are there: John, Paul, Ringo, and Yoko.
Yes, there's no George, we don't think.
There's no George. He's not prepared to indulge John.
But that's setting ourselves up for the January '69 John,
Yeah.
Paul, Ringo, Yoko session. Whole lot of Yoko,
Yeah.
which we all like. But it is interesting that it sort of has to be explained to the band, as Ringo comically says years later, we go home and tell our wives what we did, and John said, well, I'm just going to have her here all the time, and that's
Yeah.
that's
I
Ringo's
mean,
take on it.
John says this, and this I find intriguing, is that John said later he had to get permission.
John had to get permission.
Yeah, he
From
said,
who?
well, presumably from the other Beatles.
I give that a big hum. I don't know about that.
I don't know about that either. But that's but here we are, day one, first time back in the studio since mid-February, pre-India. Yoko's there.
Yeah.
I don't know. She's sitting on an amp. Maybe she's sitting on George's amp if
sitting on George's
he's not
biscuits.
There. Yeah.
And it's a whole new world. And I think that they're setting sail on Revolution because it is a great song, and it's the analogy I've used before, Stephen, is that it's like Stevie Nicks' songs in Fleetwood Mac, that
Okay.
That maybe Lindsay is the overbearing, hyper-talented one, but Stevie is the one that's got the emotional map for what's going on,
What's going on? Okay.
So Stevie's John Lennon and Lindsay is Paul in that analogy.
We'll come back to that.
That's
Okay.
for our third podcast.
Yeah.
The Thunder Only Happens When It's Raining podcast. Anyway, so you talk about the usual players being there, but the other players are kind of around as well, which is George Martin, Jeff Emerick, who's starting to get a bit of the collywobbles.
Yes. One of the sources and one of the books that I read doing a bit of research for this is his Here, There, and Everywhere book, and I think I've made my feelings clear previously about this book. It's so biased against George in particular, so dismissive of Ringo that I sort of have lost faith in his objectivity. But he does give a very detailed description of this first day, and he does record the fact that he says Paul seemed unusually subdued that night. Perhaps he was annoyed that John was dominating the proceedings so much. Um, my own take on that might be that Yoko was there,
Yeah.
because that's that's a new factor and just changes the dynamic.
Yeah.
Emmerich also recounts an argument that he had with John, where John he asked John to turn his guitar down, or points out that it's sort of it's distorting, and there's a bit of a set two here about this. Emmerich says George Martin would not go down onto the studio floor and speak to Lennon about this, but sent him down.
Yeah.
And Lennon was saying, no, I want this to be overdriven. Now, this is an acoustic guitar he's playing, but he's got everything turned up. And Emmerich then has to go and fix to get that distorted sound.
Yeah.
And he said he uses the same technique as he did by pushing a preamp up that he did on the vocal for I Am the Walrus.
I've just as a side point, years ago, I used to play around with a little 4-track tape machine, and I did not have an electric guitar at the time. And it is a fun thing to do, where you just totally overload your tape machine to make your electric sound like an acoustic. It's and it sort of totally blasts out.
Well, again, the other parallel is this is what the Stones are doing.
Yeah.
Somewhere far away in another part of town, they are doing the same thing with acoustic guitars and little toy drum kits, setting up the bedrock for Street Fighting Man. So it's interesting that they're both working in a similar fashion.
And as a side point, it's also interesting, Chris Thomas is also there as George Martin's assistant. That's his first day on the job. He's 21 years old. And Chris Thomas goes on to, well, he's working in the Beatle universe in these last few years, but he goes on to, work with the Sex Pistols and a whole bunch of people and produce Back to the Egg, which is in 1979. So he's learning the skill of producing, and that's a pretty amazing first session to see. First Beatles session. So they go through a number of recordings of the song on May 30th, and as we said, George doesn't seem to be there, and it's John, Paul, and Ringo, and it's John on acoustic, Ringo on drums, obviously, Paul on a piano, and they work up to 18 takes, and again, what we were saying a few minutes ago, this is kind of Plastic Ono band stuff, really. It's just a tight trio getting into the groove, the very core nugget of the song in a way.
Yeah, sort of this stripped back, acoustic guitar, distorted. It's very like Plastic Ono band.
Yeah, and we're lucky now that we get to hear the final take, which is take 18, which is now the opening track of the first disc of studio outtakes on the Beatles White Album box set. And if you're coming to, because it's that take 18 that we probably need to focus in on, because that's what becomes not only Revolution 1, but it also gets hived off in part to form Revolution 9.
Yes.
And at this point, Revolution 1 is actually just called Revolution, because we don't...
It's all there is.
Well, it's all there is. And that's really interesting as well, that it's the 30th of May. They're bringing in this song. And, as a self-contained song, you can hear on the demo, it's a great song. But it's actually going to become 3 totally different things, and that's not obvious on day one. That's not part of the plan at all.
No.
And it's echoes of the whole Strawberry Fields Forever situation, where John brings in a new song and they're cutting version after version of it, and it turns into different things, and they're all worthy things.
Yes. I mean, this idea of them just jamming at the end of a particular take, they've never, I think, before done anything with that. They'll do it again in the future. So the early takes of Something have John vamping away on the piano, a rather sort of odd coda to that song that he then takes and uses on Plastic Ono Band. But yes, they can have it does intrigue me as to whether or not John had the idea that this entire sort of 10-minute take would be the finished um, article, because Yoko is present. She just happens to have a tape with her that she plays.
So what's she doing? She has a tape recorder in her hands or something, is it? And
Yeah,
she's
she
playing
she
loops of speech or something.
yeah, she seems to have come in with presumably a tape that she has made up of loops and recitations and sound effects and things like that. And certainly, Mark Lewison says, at take 14, you suddenly get the first appearance of this tape playing in the background.
Hmm.
So there's this notion of random sounds, or now this is something that they've done on Tomorrow Never
Yeah.
Knows, obviously themselves, where
Like
they
the
had
walrus with
constructed
the radio as well. Yeah.
yeah. So she's in there, she's got a tape, and this starts to be heard.
Yeah.
So the take 18, you get these coming again. Paul is vamping on the piano. He starts doing the shooby doo wop
Yep.
vocals. You get that phrase, maybe if you become naked,
Yes.
which then crops up. So this makes it, that phrase is making its first appearance on this tape that Yoko is bringing into the
And so it's
studio.
interesting because if you're listening to it, you might think, oh, it's just Yoko talking in the background, but it's not. It's Yoko manipulating a tape
Yes. Yeah.
of her talking, and the tape is going into its own microphone, basically, or its
Yes.
own,
Yes.
so
That
it's
must be
just being picked up by some microphone.
yeah. And then the jam is sort of continuing over the top of that and becomes this other thing. And you wonder, did she have, was this prearranged? Did John sit down and say, "Hey guys, Yoko's got this tape she's going to play," or did this just happen spontaneously? I mean, that's the fly on the wall
Yeah.
situation. You'd like to see how that developed and what.
And this final take 18, if you actually go to the Lewis and Sessions book, he sort of says that take 18 is different. It's not like they did 17 takes like this. This
No.
take 18 has, the first 3 to 4 minutes of song, and then
Yeah.
this back end 6 minutes of very, very different vamping. And as I said, we can hear it on the box set now or on your streaming services of choice. And what's interesting is that John is either consciously or subconsciously, he's vocalizing in a way that you could say is Yoko like, where he's trying to get
Yes.
through, you
Yes.
know, get kind of a scream or a noise or sort of, that kind of ululating that Yoko sometimes is known for or mocked for. And he's reaching up into that with the groans and the squawks and all the rest.
Yes. Yes. So this is so this is their first day back. This is their first song that they're recording, and suddenly they're off in this completely different direction. Yoko's right in the middle, and she's participating, not just sort of
Passively.
passively, or they brought people in before to do backing vocals or people who've been in the studio, but suddenly she is actively participating and driving or steering this song in a particular direction.
There's an influence there, yeah.
Yeah, that must have been. I mean, that must have been quite a shock.
And you listen to that 10-minute take 18, and you kind of get this feeling, once you get into minute 5 and minute 6, that everyone's like, "Oh, this is a good idea. Whatever's happening,
Yes,
this hasn't
yes,
happened before. Let's keep doing this." And it's Ringo, he is the he is the tick, or what is it he
yeah.
says? I am the
He,
click.
I am the track. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and Ringo is being the click, and it's just he's keeping it locked down. And again, it's just 3 instruments. Although on that take 18, you hear a bit of an organ noise at the end. I'm not sure where that's coming from. And it's great. It's organized chaos, but it's capturing a moment.
It is, as I say, it must have been shocking. I imagine that it heads off in that direction, but to everyone's credit, they stick with it. They kind of grab it and they go with it. And no one, I suppose any of them at any time could just have said, right, that's it, or called a halt. But they do. They could, obviously there is something there. I have to say, I do really enjoy Take 18. I do really like.
Yeah,
The
John
vibe
sounds
that they
happy.
get.
He sounds happy
Yeah.
as he gets through it. And but this is the bedrock for what becomes Revolution 1, Revolution 9, as we said. And when you listen to the Take 18, especially when John is singing the right, 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 that we know later on
Yeah.
from Revolution 9, it's really striking to hear it in context. And I think it makes, as we'll talk about later on, it gives Revolution 9 almost makes a lot more sense when you hear
It
it in this form.
it does. I mean, it really, really does. Revolution 9, if you hear that out of context, it's just a crazy, chaotic thing. But here you can actually see the foundation that it's built on. And just to go back to that point where you were saying John sounds happy, perhaps that's what Paul is responding to,
Yeah.
because he's vamping away on the piano and then he starts the kind of 50s shooby doo wop
Yep.
backing vocal. So he's actively participating and entering into the spirit of the thing.
But it's great because that kind of moment where Paul is doing shooby doo wop, sometimes Paul gets, knocked down for, doing kind of cheesy things, honey pie and all that kind of stuff. You gave me the answer and all the rest. But, it takes a moment like that in a John song and that John will, incorporate it into the song. And that's where it all
Mm,
works brilliantly.
yes,
And I can't imagine Paul wasn't anything but happy working on that session.
I think that does come across,
Yeah.
and it's interesting that Emmerich says Paul was very subdued, but he doesn't really um, sort of deal with the sort of apparent joy or enthusiasm that then
Yeah,
emerges in
but he's
these
in a
later
recording
tapes.
studio making music. So listen,
Yeah,
that's better than being in an Apple meeting for.
yeah,
So it's a long day. It's roughly a 12-hour session. The official papers say 2:30 p.m. to 2:40 a.m. doing Revolution, and then they are back in studio the next day, Friday the 31st of May. Again, they've blocked booked the studio from 2:30 to midnight through to the end of July. They're back in on Friday the 31st of May, and George is in tow as well. But John and Yoko were busy that morning. They were house hunting. Is
yes.
that
They
right?
were out house hunting. So at one point, I can't repeat the language, but John said he would be prepared to live in a tent
Oh
um,
gosh,
if he was with Yoko, but then clearly decided, well, perhaps a house would be better.
a very large house.
So very large house. So this is they're out earlier in the day with Pete Shotton looking for a house, which ultimately would lead them to Tittenhurst.
Yeah, the famous Tittenhurst.
Famous Tittenhurst.
And May the 31st, the following day, they're in the smaller Studio 3, and John is working on vocals, Paul is putting on a bass, and Paul and George are putting on the official kind of shooby-doo-wop backing
Yeah.
vocals. And it's, they are building on this take 18.
Yes, and the interesting point here is about the lyrics. So they're adding, John is doing the lead vocals, and he's still refining the lyric.
Yes.
There's an engineer, Alan Brown, who was there, and he was saying, he was in the control room of Studio 3, and then suddenly in the darkness of the studio, going over and over the lines of the song is John Lennon. He said he's going through the song, and every time he's changing a word or two about "you can count me out, you can count me in." So he's still at this point clearly has decided, count me out, count me in. He hasn't come to a definitive response.
But he is going to. We know which way he comes down, but that's with the next vocal
Yeah,
session, I think, where he makes that one. So that's Friday the 31st of May, and then they have a few days off, and they're back in studio on Tuesday the 4th of June, and they are still working on the first song from the White Album, which is Revolution, which is still called Revolution. It's Revolution
yeah,
1. And this is another kind of crazy day in EMI Studio
yes,
3.
yes.
It's their days are quite packed.
They are. And I mean, before we actually get into the studio, if I can mention, this is the day that supposedly John and Paul earlier in the day meet Italian film director Franco Zeffirelli.
Yes, and this is on Paul's behalf or something, isn't it?
Yes, and I'm not quite sure why John would be there, but
Or
supposedly
was
Franco.
Yoko there? Maybe. I suppose she was.
Maybe she was. Yeah, Well, Zeffirelli supposedly offers Paul the role of Romeo, of course. Perhaps Yoko was going to be Juliet.
Unlikely.
Uh, in Romeo and Juliet, which was a hugely successful film by Zeffirelli, comes out later in 1968. And Paul talks about this, and the actress who ultimately played Juliet, Olivia Hussey, has talked about this, and she describes being out at a nightclub with Paul, and Paul squiring her around the night spots of of London. And Paul has talked about this as well, but he very diplomatically says, "Oh yes, I was out with Olivia Hussey. This is long before I met Linda."
Well, that doesn't add up. A good
No,
lawyer would shoot holes in that.
I think he's just being diplomatic
Diplomatic.
there. But can I give you my top trivia points?
Yes, go on. This is about the Romeo and Juliet film.
Yes, the
Okay, I'll sit
actor,
back. Go.
the actor who did get, you'd love these
I
trivia
love the
points.
trivia.
There's a Monkeys reference. You'll
Yeah.
enjoy that. The actor who got the part was Leonard Whiting, and he was most famous for having replaced Davy Jones in the cast of Oliver, which allowed Davy and the rest of the cast to go off to Broadway and appear on the Ed Sullivan Show at the same time as the Beatles.
Yes, Davy Jones from the Monkees was on that first Ed Sullivan Show with the Beatles. It's strange but true.
So there you go.
Yeah, and he did he have any other significant career? Do we know him?
Oh,
From
I see where
anything
you're
else?
going. He no, I mean as an actor, no, but he sang lead vocals on a song called "The Raven," which I don't know,
Yes,
on the first Alan Parsons project.
the Alan Parsons Project. Yes,
I can say I have never knowingly heard a song by the Alan Parsons project.
another side point. I would say I went through a streaming overview of Alan Parsons Project, and the album that's worth getting is iRobot. That's a top record.
Okay.
I never really plugged into the rest of them, but iRobot is a synthesizer-tastic album of madness. So yeah, but they are in the studio working on more things to do with Revolution, and I may be inspired by Yoko being there. Paul brings someone to the studio.
Yes, Paul brings his new girlfriend, Francie Schwartz, to the
Francie
studio.
Schwartz. Now she's one of these names that pops up in
Yeah.
Beatle lore. There's a very small window where she appears. It's this kind of middle of right bang splat in the middle of '68.
Yes, so there's a lot going on in Paul's love life in '68, but she seems to have been, or she would say she was a very serious girlfriend.
Mm.
Uh, she began her relationship with Paul, she says, at the same time that he was engaged to Jane Asher.
Yeah.
And Jane discovering Paul and Francie Schwartz together was really the cause of the end of that relationship, that engagement. Francie Schwartz had gone to London to pitch one of her scripts to Apple, supposedly. And then Paul took her back to his place to show her his Magrittes.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to get some Magrittes. But she is around all through the summer. She is there living effectively in Cavendish Avenue with Paul at the time that John and Yoko move in.
Yeah.
She is present in July on the Mad Day Out, where they have that very famous sort of photo session.
She chooses the locations, doesn't she? Or she's involved in some of the locations?
She's involved in that. She takes some pictures. I always imagined that is sort of Don McCullum and Tom Murray and the Beatles, but there's a whole entourage there. Yoko's there, Francie Schwartz is there. So there's a sense at this stage, I think, that Paul is sort of elevating her to the same status as Yoko.
Yeah.
She's my girlfriend, so I'm going to bring her. She wrote a book. Have you read that book?
I, of course, have not read the book.
The book is called Body Count.
Okay.
It was written in 1972. It is a truly awful book.
Why is it awful?
It's just, it's the most overwritten, flowery prose. And let me tell you, there is no detail of their relationship that she's not prepared to elaborate on.
Oh, dear.
So it's a very, very difficult book to find, and I can only imagine that Paul bought and burned every copy he could get his hands on. I do not recommend it. I have a copy of it on PDF that somebody very kindly sent me. A listener on this podcast sent me the book.
Oh gosh,
it's a terrible, terrible book.
And she also, what's interesting about the whole White Album thing is there's very little documentary evidence of what's going on, but there is a bit of film footage of the Blackbird recording, and she's in that somewhere, isn't she? She's knocking around in the background.
She is. So you can see her on that promotional film. She supposedly does sing some backing vocals that come through on takes of Revolution 9.
Yeah.
So suddenly, but everyone's in the studio. Patty Harrison is singing on
Yeah.
Birthday. Yoko's there. I think Maureen is singing backing vocals. So suddenly, it's maybe John bringing Yoko has made it okay to bring the wives in.
By the way, do we know where Francie Schwartz is today?
No,
Oh,
no, I
okay.
don't. I don't know. And
Hanging out with Jimmy Nicol, probably.
probably hanging out with Jimmy Nicol. I
Uh,
honestly no, I don't know. I don't know.
so they
Someone will know. Someone will
someone
tell
will
us.
tell us. Maybe she's listening. Hi there. So on this day in the studio, again, full tilt, June 4th, they're working on Revolution, and what they do is they start adding to this take 18
Yeah.
that they've done the previous week, and this gets called take 20. And this
Yes.
is actually a bootleg that you can look up on YouTube and the like. And it's interesting because again, John knows he's doing something, but he's not sure what he's doing, and there's lots of things going on. First of all, he's redoing his vocal, and
Yes.
this is famously there's a picture in Lewison's studio sessions book. He always wanting his vocal to sound different. He decides he's going to lie flat on his back and sing into a microphone suspended above his head because why not?
Why not?
And
Why not?
so he puts down his lead vocal for Revolution. So I think this is where he puts down "You can count me out, count me in." That's where
Yes, I
that
think
gets
this
put
is
down
where
on this day.
this arrives at this point. Yeah.
And it's important for the record, Your Honor, that the first finalized version of the Revolution/Revolution 1 lyric is, "When you talk about destruction, don't you know you can count me out in." It's the first one
Yes.
he records, but that's
Yes.
important later on because that's not
Yeah.
the first one that people hear.
Yeah.
And they're also gathering around the mic, and what are they doing? They're doing tape loops and backing vocals and all sorts of crazy stuff.
Yes, it reminds me of some of the descriptions you get of the Beach Boys sessions for Smile, where people
Yeah.
are kind of crunching gravel and setting off fire alarms and crunching vegetables and it's just crazy stuff going on. And this is the take that begins with John saying, "Take your knickers off and let's go," in one of his sort of comedy goon voices.
Yeah.
This first, I hadn't heard this until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it suddenly appeared on YouTube. I think was the first,
Hmm.
and it's fantastic. I love this take,
Yeah.
this mix.
It's yeah, you wonder maybe it escaped at the time of the assembly for the 2018 box. It's not on the 2018 box,
It's
obviously.
it's it's a source of great irritation to me. There are many things irritate me, but this irritates me.
Well, I think I can understand why. I think I think they probably came down to a choice between the original unadorned take 18 or this kind of overdub remix take 20. And I think take 18 is better to hear it in its skeletal form. Take 20 is a different version of the same thing. So I don't think they could have put both on. Again, they're not doing the Bob Dylan let's include everything for historical accuracy type
Yeah, but
situation.
why could they not put you've got the Esher demo,
I know.
you've got an early take, you've got 18, you've got 20, and then you've got the sort
Yeah.
of finished songs. I mean, what I'm interested in, and this is probably the song that shows it more than any other, is that evolution
Yes.
of the sound picture and that sort of hiving off. And I look forward to the 60th anniversary box set where all of these, including Take 20,
Will
are
appear.
available.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're doing vocals, backing vocals. They're doing tape loops again. There's part of it that sounds a bit, a bit repetitive in terms of there's a bit of a Tomorrow Never Knows vibe going on.
Yeah.
There's two very sort of loud tape loops that come in and out of it that sound very much alike. The Beatles going ah and a big kind of guitar note,
Yeah.
and it's kind of got a screeching thing that reminded me a bit like Armenia City in the Sky from the Who Sell Out,
Oh,
that kind
yes.
of
Yes. Yes. Yes.
it's
Yeah.
kind of got that kind of dronal noise that just kind of fades in and out over and over again. So I think I could see why they'd get to the end of the recording session and go, this
Maybe
isn't
not too
this
much.
yeah, this hasn't cracked a nut. Like when we did take 18, we were onto something new. This isn't what to do next with this. I could see why they might think that, but it's around about this point that what does happen is that this Revolution 1 recording gets hived off into
Yes.
Revolution 1 and Revolution 9. And
Yes.
so this back end, this last 6 minutes of this take gets taken away, and it's that's Tuesday the 4th of June. They're doing all these tape loops. Wednesday the 5th of June they work on Don't Pass Me By, and it's on Thursday the 6th of June that they start to assemble a different thing, which is Revolution 9. And we're going to focus on Revolution 9 in part 2 of this
Yeah.
Revolution talk. But that's where this division happens after this 4th of June session. So if we stay on the Revolution 1 track for a
Yeah.
moment, this kind of gets put aside for a few weeks. They start to arrange stuff. The next focused session on that is June 21st.
That's right.
And
That's
that's
right.
just John and George at this point, isn't it?
This is John and George sort of putting the finishing touches. So Paul is in America at
Yeah.
this point at the Beverly Hills Hilton, addressing the Capital Sales Convention. So he's effectively over there announcing that all of the Apple records will be distributed by Capitol. He's playing a little promotional tape. The Blackbird session that you talked about earlier, he plays that film
Yeah.
and is generally sort of glad handing and doing the PR stuff. John and George are back in the studio, overdubbing brass. So there's that sort of brass arrangement: two
Yep.
trumpets, four trombones. George Martin has written the score there. They make two attempts at that, and they turn take 20 effectively into take 22, onto which George plays his lead guitar.
Electric guitar riff at the start.
Yeah.
And that lead electric guitar riff, whether that's the seed that leads us to the re-recording of Revolution, it certainly would seem to be the stepping stone, that noise. That's kind of, you can see the DNA that gets you from that point to the re-recording of.
That's the fascinating thing to me about this song in particular, is you can it's that exactly it. It's that DNA. So you've got these various strands, and the other intriguing thing is the choices they make. I'm not sure in any of the re-releases, certainly, anthology and the box sets, that you could ever say they didn't make the right choice.
Yes.
In terms of the take or the arrangement or the part. But this is the song that sort of spawns the most diverse sort of iterations.
Yes. And so this is on June the 21st, and they probably think that they're finished the song. They end the session by doing a load of stereo mixes for it, just John and George. And what's interesting at this point is that, this is June 21st. It started on May 30th. The only song that Paul has put down in this stage is Blackbird, which he puts down.
Yes.
There's one session where John is in the room on the 11th of June where he just goes over and over and over again trying to nail down Blackbird, which is one of the more fun bootleg things you can listen to, is all 30 odd takes of Blackbird.
Well, it is, and John making suggestions from the control room that Paul is studiously ignoring.
But Paul still hasn't done a band recording for the White Album. We're almost a month into recording. It's really interesting. And so on the 21st of June, they think they do these stereo mixes. They believe that they're finished. There's a little bit of Revolution 9 work going on in the background as well. And then, they're out of the studio for the whole weekend. But there's an interesting, crazy thing that happens over the weekend.
So bear in mind, of these various stereo mixes made on the 21st, John must have taken an acetate of this home. So on the 22nd, which is the Saturday, John and Yoko fly from Luton to Shannon in Ireland by jet, and then they take a helicopter to the island of Dornish. Somewhere in the west, I believe.
West coast of Ireland, yes, wherever that is.
This is that's an in joke. This is this is an island that John had bought in May 1967 for £1,500. I always thought this was just one of his crazy acid-filled, fueled notions. Wouldn't it be nice to have an island somewhere? And I wasn't sure what he was actually going to do with it. But I was reading that Chip Mattinger book, Lennonology, and he says that he actually had commissioned a firm of architects, Hildebrand and Glicker Architects, to design an absolute state-of-the-art recording facility. So as far away from the rest of Europe as you can get
Yeah,
without being in America, that's the place to build a recording studio. And it was going to be called Irish Mythical Studios.
right.
So there you go.
It,
But
it
anyway,
is odd though that he has to summon the architects and summon the design as if the studio is going to make the stuff. If you just compare that to Paul going up to Mull of Kintyre,
yes,
where
yes.
it's just like, actually,
Here's a barn.
here's a barn, here's a tape recorder.
That'll do.
Let's see what we can get on with. It's curious.
You wonder, did he really have in mind, something like the Apple Studio, that third parties would come and use it? And
I think I don't know. I
maybe
think
it was just an acid fueled
yeah,
notion.
but also if you want to get deep and personal, we all sort of make deals with ourselves in our head that, oh,
Mm,
if I could just do these things, then that'd be right and
yeah.
happy, and I could everything would be okay. And so there might have been a bit of that going on,
Well,
just
this was May '67 was when he bought the island, so I suppose
yeah.
that was right in the middle of just before Pepper, and
Mm. I'm
but
sure it was a
but they
tax dodge anyway.
could have been. They
Mm.
get to the island.
Yes.
He has the acetate in his hand, and he realizes he doesn't have a record player. So, doing what any self-respecting millionaire rock star would do, he sends the helicopter back to Westport with Ronan O'Reilly.
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce that?
Ronan O'Reilly, yeah.
Who was?
He was the founder of Radio Caroline, wasn't he?
Yeah,
Yeah, and he
yeah,
only died earlier in 2020.
yeah. So John, Yoko, and Pete Shotton stay on the island, and Ronan heads back to Westport with the helicopter to look for a battery-powered turntable, which I'm
Mm.
not sure in Westport in 1968 that would be a
Yeah,
particularly common.
I don't
But
think
he
so.
But he must have found it, because the helicopter gets back to the island, and John has talked about, oh, we played the acetate on the island, and it was glorious, and it was so magical. In the interim, a storm has blown up, and they need to take shelter. So fortunately, John has flown a caravan from the garden in Kenwood to the island, and this is Julian's psychedelic Sergeant Pepper caravan. So Julian obviously doesn't need it anymore, and it is on the island. And then they all fly off to the Great Southern Hotel at the end of the day.
And yeah, they're hanging out with this is the Great Southern Hotel in Mulranny in the west of Ireland, and they're hanging out with there's a bunch. Do they play the record, we think, to the people there, or we
Yeah,
don't really know?
what seems to happen is they arrive on the evening of the 22nd, and go straight to bed. They get up the next day, go for a visit to Achill Island, and then when they come back, the hotel has very kindly organised a special Irish concert, compared by Tony Chambers,
Yes.
featuring the Malloy brothers, Dominic Grady, Mrs. Larry McGovern, and Peggy Jennings, who is the hotel receptionist. They all get up and do a turn.
This is fantastic. Now I've spoken to my source,
Yes.
the Tony Chambers Band were an act in the region at the time. They are apparently represented in the 1980s Irish film The Ballroom of Romance, which talks about
Okay.
the Irish show band circuit of the 1960s. And the Malloy brothers were an act out of Mayo in Ireland who were still touring up until the 21st century. So that's
So
information I got from my dad. Thank you,
there
Noel.
you go. Well, it all sounds very quaint, if I can say that.
Yeah,
And
no, it
then
does.
and then suddenly John reciprocates this generosity by cranking the volume up and playing Revolution.
Yeah.
So that must have been quite some end to the evening.
It's quite interesting. The ballroom circuit in Ireland in the 1960s, as a 20-second synopsis, was an alcohol-free circuit of cover version bands that would tour around Ireland and play cover versions of UK and American hits with some original material to crowds of about 2,000 who would jump up and down and dance, mainly in church halls and in hotel function rooms.
Yeah.
And it was a very lucrative circuit at the time. And it's just interesting to think that a Beatle parachuted into all of this and said, that's very interesting. Just press pause on the Hucklebuck there for a second. Here's Revolution, burn it all, let's go. And then he
Yeah, it's
flies
it's
himself out of there.
it's insane. I mean, it is absolutely nuts.
Yeah, I didn't.
But
It's extraordinary to find that out.
but the good news is that the Great Southern Hotel has the John Lennon suite.
Oh,
I don't know what the room rates are, but you can get there on the 440 bus route from Westport or the 52 Bus Éireann Goldliner.
I think we're getting to a level of detail in this podcast that people just
But
don't
people
want.
will want to go and see
It might be
where
cheaper than
this.
the Montreal Hilton, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Anyway, the upside of this is after their long weekend away is that they come back in on June 25th, scrap those stereo mixes and do another set. So obviously the maybe it was Tony Chambers said, John, you need to pan that bass a little bit better.
Yeah, but
Who
the but
knows?
but but the really fantastic thing is that these are the only people
Who've heard that?
who've heard this mix.
That is true.
So
That's
this is an absolutely unique mix. That this acid, where is that acetate now? I mean,
well, they break, they disappear, they wear
yeah.
out.
So that these are the only people that have heard that mix. That's a fantastic thing. All joking aside, that would be a fantastic claim to fame.
So we're here almost a month in after recording. It's June 25th. They mix off Revolution 1. Revolution 9 is coming into play. But this is where we might need to take a break because we're going to look at the rest of Revolution in part 2 of this podcast because we still have to talk about Revolution 9, the Revolution B-side, and what it all means once it hits the streets. I think that's a good place to leave it, don't you think so?
I think so, and we've secured our sponsorship from the Irish Tourist Board. So,
Yes, get to the Great Southern in Mulroney. So that's what we'll be talking about next week on the second half of our podcast discussion about the Beatles song Revolution. Thank you very much again for listening to us. We're available to get in touch with in all the usual places on Twitter at BeatlesPod, on the private Twitter or private Facebook group that Stephen is the moderator of. So he'll let you in there. And wherever you download your podcasts, if you feel like leaving us a nice review, that's always appreciated. So thank you very much. But until next time, I'm Jason Carty.
I'm Stephen Cockcroft.
And this has been Nothing Is Real. Thank you for listening. Nothing Is Real is powered by Acast.